One.
Someone asked Charlie the other day when he spoke here 2 weeks ago, get inside his head question. It was towards the end of the session. And everybody reacted very
I would like to introduce today Fredo Arias-King, is that right? Yes. A Mexican-born political thinker and entrepreneur whose career has centered on democratic transitions in Eastern Europe and former Soviet space. He founded Demokratizatsiya, a journal of post-Soviet democratization, and has advised reform leaders across the region on post-communist transformation. Fredo also played a key role in Mexico's own democratic breakthrough in 2002 as a senior advisor to future president at the time, Vicente Fox, in his campaign. Today, he leads the Prague-based Kassler Institute, connecting lessons from Eastern Europe to Latin America reformers. He is also a part of this house. He was part of the establishment and part of leading this house. Thank you very much for that. And without further ado, should I put the video right away?
Sure, yeah.
Yes.
Let's put that. Thank you very much. I guess because this 10-minute video summarizes pretty much, you know, what all these other papers I've written, 40-page papers, 10-page papers about Putin's psychology. So those of you who don't understand Russian, that's okay, because I will repeat some of the basic sort of lessons. And after I get this 10-minute video, then we can get into So as you can tell, it's not exactly a light topic to discuss, or very obvious. The tools to diagnose someone like Putin are not very well known, but nonetheless, it's completely necessary to discuss this for many reasons, right? Not the least of which is why he behaves the way he does, how he may behave, how he will react to certain stimuli, how he relates to other world leaders. So we'll talk about that, in the next 10, 15 minutes in addition to this video. But first of all, I'd like to thank the Free Peoples of Russia House for having me back here, and several friends, old friends, new friends. I have here, well, some of them sitting in the front, Harley and Margie, who I've known for how long now? Well, 30 some years since we've been in this great adventure together studying Russia. And also Jason Smart, who interviewed me the other day in his podcast. There's Ann Smith, who used to work for Jesse Helms back in the day, in charge of Soviet policy at the Center for Foreign Relations Committee. So then I look forward to, meeting the rest of you who I either just met or don't know very well. But anyway, and also would like to acknowledge a lot of these faces on the walls, and so happy to be surrounded by such figures that I knew. Half of them I knew personally very well, or still do. For example, Petya Verzilov over there, the founder of Pussy Riot, is the one that did this video for Media Zona. Yuri Shekoshikin was practically my brother. And, and Galina Starovoitova, I guess who voted instead of Galina Starovoitova at the Congress of People's Deputies once. That was supposed to be a secret. Harley did. He was also very close to her. But anyway, so let's jump right in, and then of course we have questions, answers, I guess a lively discussion afterwards. So I've written somewhat about, as the video mentioned, on Putin's psychopathologies having to do with his sexuality, I guess. And how do we know a lot of what Putin does is because, even though it's not, let's just to put it mildly, these things are not really taught in school anymore. But both my parents, dedicated many years to helping people in this condition back in Mexico when things were just horrible. Now Mexico is way better, thank God. The gays can be open and proud and live their lives. But back in the day, well, the machismo culture and all that. But even in New York, even in Vienna, where famous Edmund Bergler practiced, he was a student of Freud's, of psychoanalysis, and unlike Carl Jung or others, he stayed very loyal to Freud. And Edmund Bergler dedicated 40-some years of his life to only one thing: to help and treat gay men in denial in both New York and Vienna back in the day. And what's interesting here, I have some of his books. This one, for example, and this one. And they were published in the 1960s. But if you read them, they are, Vladimir Putin is practically on every page, which is interesting, But my parents, of course, based a lot of their techniques in helping these people that would show up at the house, basically, in very bad state. They would pull out a cigarette and, tremble like this and light it and say, "Doctor, please make me a goddamn normal. Make me a goddamn normal." Which tells you a lot of how these gays would suffer throughout history, through all of mankind's history. It's only they can be born in Canada or Sweden, if they're lucky, in California or whatever, and live a normal life. But still, most of the world is, treats them very badly. And also kind of reflects how, what you call internalized homophobia. They've been put down so much, and they've been oppressed and sometimes physically accosted, that they believe it. They believe that they are somehow subhuman or defective. And so when they would say, "Doctor, please make me a goddamn normal," they don't see themselves as normal, which is interesting, But anyway, so later on, my father, in addition to seeing these people, it was always on ad hoc basis and kind of out of pro bono. They never charged that's why I don't call them patients, because, what do you call somebody that you're just sort of counseling and advising for free? But Bergler did live from that. So he, 40-some years, And he wrote yet another book besides these two on his experiences in dealing with homosexual men. And these are active homosexuals who are in denial, by the way. I make that distinction because in Russia, especially, for some reason, they always translate it into latently gay, latent gays. I'm not familiar with that at all. And I don't think burglar was either, neither were my parents. These are active homosexuals who were ashamed of being homosexuals, hated themselves for being homosexuals. Most of them were married with kids or had a career. Some of them were even famous. I remember some famous Mexicans, being treated by my parents. And I'd be like, wait, isn't that the guy who comes out on TV? You don't ever, don't tell anybody in school that, that we're helping him, we're treating him. So anyway, you learn a lot by meeting some of these, these patients, I guess you can call them. So anyway, my publications on Putin's psychosexuality help us understand his contradictions, because as Andreas Umland and Wendy Sherman, one is a scholar, one is a practitioner. She was in charge. Wendy was in the State Department and dealing with the Ukraine crisis. And so many other scholars, they cannot understand why Putin behaves the way he does. He seems to sort of go against the rational choice theories that we take for granted in political science or other disciplines, So here is my father's book, which he published in 1997, because he noticed that a lot of the people he was treating, these homosexual men in denial, had an obsession, something burglar had not noticed, curiously, but they have an obsession with 3 Jungian archetypes. Of course, I'm talking about Carl Jung, who dedicated a lot of his writings on analyzing archetypes and how powerfully archetypes influence us as human beings. So my father noticed that these men had an obsession with 3 specific archetypes, which is poison, mutilation, and puncture, interestingly. So in their poetry, you read a lot about scorpions and snakes and knives and daggers and mutilation and castration and things like that. So he wrote this book, Primera Antología de la Poesía Homosexual, in 1997, and I know he was going to write a second one. He was always meaning to write a second one based on these are sort of the classical, from history, but then he was going to write one based on just his sort of patients. And he never got around to it for some reason. But anyway, doesn't matter. He did write some individual papers on it. So adding up the symptoms, the observable symptoms, because other symptoms are like, well, you would need Putin's cooperation. He would need to lie down on a couch and, tell me about your childhood, and he would need to be open, and actually that's not going to happen, obviously. So these symptoms that involve feelings and fears and things that you cannot see, I'm leaving out. But just the observable symptoms between burglar, my father's, collections, plus a few others that I discovered that have been discussed in this gay affirmative journal, academic journal called the Journal of Homosexuality. So, more modern, obviously, researchers. If you add those symptoms, more or less associated with these gay men in denial, you get 21 symptoms. And it turns out Vladimir Putin has 20 out of the 21, but they fit like a glove almost, But I'll discuss kind of the main 4 here. One of them, as the title of the paper you saw over there, published a few years ago, is called Nursing Injustices, which seems to be Putin's sort of trademark. All the time he's complaining about, nas obmanuli, they lied to us, they did this to us, we in Russia were so open to the West, and then they betrayed us. They are always betraying him, and he's nursing injustices constantly. A documentary maker named Ina Kurochkina recently had in one of her documentaries a collection of all these nursing injustices, and she mentioned in the comments there that Putin sometimes acts like a spurned lover. In other words, to that intensity he acts, which is not for everybody. In other words, masochism would be another trait, and burglar incessantly discusses the masochism of his patients. In fact, that's something that really bothers people like burglar, who treated homosexual men and they need understanding, you know? Rejection in this homophobic environment, you know? Even when they knew it was extremely risky back in the 80s and 90s because of HIV, many of these gay men in denial would engage in all kinds of high-risk behavior, and that's how they contracted HIV, even though they were perfectly aware of the risks and of the consequences. And again, I mean, extrapolating to Putin, of many masochistic things he has done. One of them having half of his, or almost half of Russia's foreign currency reserves in the capital of NATO, when every day he would criticize NATO and Nasab Manuli and NATO is the enemy and NATO has, you know, is plotting against Russia and NATO this and NATO that, and the West and the corrupt West and the this, that West, having half of the currency reserves of the central bank in the capital of NATO, Brussels, which of course were frozen the minute the tanks crossed into Ukraine, which tells me Putin is impulsive and Putin is masochistic. The third of these 21 that, you know, we can highlight here is, and as the video mentioned, how he treats other gays, which is a paradox, which is interesting. Gay men in denial seem to have a very tight sort of society. They kind of, this fraternity, and it can transcend borders. They betray their own governments just to stay loyal to some of their, you know, their gay friends in denial. But they absolutely obsessively hate open and proud gays. Now that is a huge paradox. And I don't think I've ever gotten an explanation from any of these books or, you know, talking personally to experts of why that is. One of them mentioned, well, it's perhaps because they're jealous, because they're living in inner hell and they're like, why does he get to be open and march in the streets and you know, and wear the rainbow colors and have a boyfriend openly and go to restaurants with his boyfriend? Well, I'm still suffering in this horrible hell, married to a woman that because I needed an alibi, you know. So maybe that's one reason, but there really hasn't been an explanation as to why. But I don't remember either Gorbachev or Yeltsin gay people in Russia. I mean, remind me if there was a case, but after 30-some years of studying Russia, I don't remember a single occasion. You know, those two leaders would attack gays. Why would they do that, right? With Putin, as we know, it's a fetish, it's an obsession. And not only that, gay influencers who I've become friends with, you know, after he read my papers, his name is Renat Davlet-Gilde, Tatar descent, and now in exile in Vilnius. And he has a show on YouTube called Gay. Small segment after he read my paper of the people surrounding Putin that, like him, like Putin, are potentially gay in denial. And these are the most homophobic people passing all kinds of legislation in the Duma, including the head of the Duma, by the way. His name is Volodin, according to Davlet Gildeev, who, of course, you know, knows very well the gay scene in Russia and is trying always to get Russia to be more tolerant of her gays and all that. In fact, I even told Renat, you know, if you succeed in Russia, that means became a civilized country. You can measure a civilized country by how they treat their sexual minorities. But anyway. And the fourth that I'd like to discuss, of course, is already touched upon, is the archetype of poison and mutilation and puncture, mutilation, and poison that my father discovered, or so he thought he had discovered, which is kind of funny story because when my father was so happy that he had discovered something that Burglar himself, the guru, had not noticed. And he published this book, and then somebody told him, oh, by the way, you didn't exactly discover this sort of it's like, that's impossible because, I did a literature search, and I know, well, they're probably not going to put that in the literature search, but Scotland Yard in London, the police, every time they find a body, or in those days, I'm not sure if they still do, but when they find some dead body somewhere, and he has been stabbed 20 times, not once or twice, but 20 times. He's been poisoned or mutilated. Scotland Yard, just by protocol, they would immediately approach their contacts in the gay community and say, who's that? And that's Jack. Oh, who was he with? Edward, I believe. So they would go see Edward. And what's funny is that the cases that my father later, when he to sort of investigate that, something funny, because these people that had killed Jack, in this case, Edward, did not even bother to hide the weapon with blood. He was just right there on his kitchen table. He seemed dazed, and he didn't even realize what had happened. It was like this sort of intense jealousy and he needed a catharsis. He probably suspected Jack was with someone else, and he just stabbed them 20 times, not 20 times. So Scotland Yard has solved a lot of crimes this way. And as you probably have guessed by now, open gays are lucky when they live in California, or Canada, or Sweden, and nobody bothers them. And those gays, gay men in particular, live the same and as on average as the heterosexual men, the amount of years on average, and they die more or less from the same, diseases. Whereas gay men in denial tend to die from harsh diseases, having to do with extreme stress, and they tend to live 5 years on average less than those men who do not hide or never hid their identity, whether heterosexual or gay. So in other words, the psychopathologies that you saw on the video and that we discuss in the papers with Mike Waller, Dr. Mike Waller co-wrote those papers with me, have nothing to do with being homosexual. Obviously, it has to do with homosexuality, and living that inner hell. And that is why coming out of the closet, that's something that, people who know how to treat men in crisis from their homosexuality and hiding it are usually advised to simply come out. Look, you need to bite the bullet. You need to tell your wife, you need to tell your boss, you need to tell, if they're grown, your children, you need to come out and be proud. And many resist till the day they die. They resist doing this, and they continue to live a double life full of schizophrenia, to put it that way. But those that do come out, and I have a whole collection of them somewhere. I just kind of, every time I see one in the media, I take a snapshot of it just to remind myself, what these theories can do is that they report day and night their health, their mood, their everything. Once they bite the bullet and they come out, and I'm talking big politicians, sports figures, all kinds of people, artists, anything that are famous, and then they come out, either that or they are outed because of some incident. They were arrested in the bathroom at an airport or whatever, and then they're forced to go before the cameras and say, well, guess what? There's many cases like that as well. It is therapeutic, and it is the basic advice that my father and my mother always gave these men, and so did Burglar. But my parents had it easier because they were, of course, closer to our modern era. Burglar was in the depths of the dark ages when it came to treating these poor people. There was no such thing as coming out and expecting to, keep your job or So anyways, that's sort of the basics of this analysis. So why are we talking about Putin and, his potential, diagnosis? Well, it has implications, believe it or not. It has implications. I mean, when my father and my mother were treating these people, I never imagined that one of them could potentially be the head of a nuclear superpower. But because, the twists of fate, I became a Sovietologist. And what a profession it is it, Harley, isn't it? But anyway, suddenly I realized, wait a minute, I know something that most other Sovietologists don't, because they've studied political science or history or sociology or something, anthropology, like Margie over here, who wrote fascinating books on, on the different nationalities of Siberia, and never a dull moment. But they did not study this, by and large. I have yet to meet a Russia expert that, kind of had that background as I did. So these are just sort of assumptions, obviously. Here I'm kind of walking on thin ice because I don't know what is happening, frankly, with the consequences of Putin's psychosexuality. But I'm willing to bet that when all is said and done, and Putin falls and he's either killed or arrested or something, a few years from now, that's going to be the standard explanation of what caused this war, what triggered this war. It's not going to be because he feared NATO. It's not going to be because he really thought Ukraine was fascist, or because it's going to be because of some spontaneous herostratic act that probably happened out of some intense jealousy, kind of like Edward stabbing Jack 20 times, and then leaving the knife right on the table, like saying, arrest me. And so this can also explain the strange relation between Putin and Donald Trump. And this is just speculation, but I've written a few articles on that as well. So if Edmund Burglar or my mother were alive today, they would probably guess that Trump doesn't react, to Putin's multiple provocations, doesn't take the bait on purpose. And there's a reason for that, unlike Biden, by the way, because of this one figure in Trump's life, who was key to understanding Donald Trump. And his name is Roy Cohn. Some of you know about Roy Cohn. You've seen the documentaries and stuff with him. He became famous, of course, after Trump got to power. Roy Cohn was Trump's lawyer for years, until he died of AIDS in 1986. Since the mid-70s, I believe he was or early 70s, his lawyer. And the guy was a pit bull, but he was, like Putin, brilliant tactician, but horrible at strategy. Masochistic in so many ways. And yet he gave Trump advice on how to win in politics, how to be aggressive and all this. But a lot of times, Roy Cohn displayed all these symptoms, these classic symptoms. For example, his homophobia was legendary. So he would take partners openly to dinners and things, and rent hotel rooms together and all that. But all the while he denied that he was a homosexual, and he even attacked homosexuals. He said homosexuals are trash, filth. So I'm sure that Trump, probably witnessing this, said, this guy is a little nuts. I'm glad he's my lawyer and he's giving me advice. I would hate to be on the opposite side of his wrath. But Roy Cohn, and it's funny how I came in contact with Roy Cohn before he was famous, before I think even Trump was elected, because, I have a good friend named Dick Morris. I'm sure you've heard of him. Dick Morris was Bill Clinton's campaign manager, and then later on he went to be campaign manager of several other world leaders. We met at the Vicente Fox campaign in Mexico in 2000, in 99, 2000, and it was kind of a secret that he was helping us, because what if the one-party regime accused the democratic Mexican opposition of, selling out the country to this crazy American who comes here? It's more paranoia than anything. But anyway, but it was, only I could sort of bring Dick Morris to Mexico, and after he saw the candidate and gave an advice, or his top lieutenants, then Dick and I, could go to restaurants and art galleries, and, basically I had him all to myself. I couldn't organize speeches for him at the university, for example, and I learned a lot. And with Dick Morris, and we became great friends. And later Dick, advised Trump, as you know. So Dick Morris is Roy Cohn's first cousin, just by the twists of fate. Sometimes I end up believing what, not Edmund Burglar, but Carl Jung talked about synchronicity. These shocking coincidences have to have a purpose. And so talking with Dick Morris, even like 20 years ago, and telling Dick Morris, I suspect that the new leader of Russia, Putin, he reminds me so much of my parents' patients and all this. And I started to describe the symptoms. And I said, for example, he does this, this, this. And Dick Morris said, that's exactly like my cousin, Roy Cohn. And I'd be like, who's Roy Cohn? So he explained who Roy Cohn was. And lo and behold, later, Trump gets elected, and now we all know Roy Cohn. So I'm just speculating that perhaps, Trump, with Roy Cohn, he learned how to navigate the psychopathologies of an aggressive homosexual man in denial. And he probably sensed that Putin was this, and he kind of put on his Roy Cohn chip, which explains how Putin can just provoke and provoke and provoke, seeking punishment, and Trump just backs off, backs off, backs off, and it drives people crazy, of course, and people have all kinds of speculations as to why Trump is doing this. European leaders can't believe that the United States is kind of backing off. But, you know, when these men provoke punishment, and that's well known just from all these books, but who does the punishment is also a pretty big deal, as you know, as we've discovered. Who does the punishment is a very big deal. So if Putin provokes, but is punished by somebody like like Barack Obama or Biden, or heaven forbid, a woman like Hillary Clinton, then they take that as an insult. It's almost like they're insulted and they need to sort of take some kind of a revenge. But if a bigger and older alpha male, such as Donald Trump, punishes them, then for them, that's a form of love. And yes, these are, you know, these people are not well. And my mom taught for years abnormal psychology at the university, including this, by the way. And these people, by definition, consider an asset as a liability or a liability as an asset in their heads. I mean, that's why we have a profession called abnormal psychology. So when they provoke, they want the right person to punish them. And what's funny is that it reminds me a little bit of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. You know, we remember Notes from Underground. There was the underground man that was intense and always thinking about this bigger guy named the officer. So the whole book is all about how he was desperate to provoke the officer in order to become his number two. So he doesn't mind, Putin, just extrapolating from all this, is that Putin is okay being the number two as long as he has a special relation to number one, which is Trump. So I think a lot of what Putin is doing and provoking is to show to the world that he's still relevant, that Russia's still relevant. And if Trump had navigated this correctly, he could have probably gotten Putin to do a lot of things that he's been unable to get Putin to do in a frustrating way, as we learn from his tweets. You know, Putin would, I think, would have responded if Trump had played his cards correctly, being comfortable as a number two as long as he has a special and exclusive relation to number one. But then, hysterically frustrated when ignored, just like the guy from Notes on Underground. But anyway, I figured this could explain why Trump is always going out of his way to make Putin special. I kind of calls Putin, he's my friend, and you know, Russia's a great power, and it could have easily defeated Ukraine, and Ukraine is playing with fire because Russia's a great power. The feeling Trump was to Putin in that regard. Look, you be my number two. I respect you. I recognize you. I'm going to be your, you can call me anytime you want, and I'm your friend as long as you kind of start to nudge you away from Ukraine or other problems that Putin was provoking all the time. But Putin keeps provoking because he probably feels Trump is not giving him the love he deserves. In other words, the punishment. Because to them, and there's a lot of theories as to why men become homosexual, but one of them is that they did not receive a lot of love or attention since literally the minute they were born, their mothers did not have enough milk. That's the Freudian, interpretation. I'm not sure if it's ever been proven. But they definitely suffered when they were little. They were given, little love. So for them, provoking is a way of getting attention, and attention equals love in their minds, the love they never got growing up. So that's why, that's another kind of strange thing that a lot of pundits couldn't make sense of Putin's constant attacks on Melania, the first lady. But my mom could have probably answered that, because I remember my mom trying to, listen and rationalize and reason, with these gays that would come to the house. And what's funny is that they would inevitably attack the wife of their lover. So they would attack the wife of the lover as if it was all her fault that those two men couldn't get together and live happily ever after. It's all the wife's fault. It's not the other guy's fault. It's not society's fault. It's that wife. And they would attack that poor wife, saying that horrible woman that's married to my friend, you know, whatever, Jose. And Jose would be with me full time if it wasn't for that awful wife of his. And she manipulates him. She manipulates him. And I remember in one case, they were so aggressive against, you know, verbally against that wife. I was just expecting my mom to say, listen, you idiot, it's your fault, obviously, because he's probably not going to leave his wife or blah, 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 or you know. And I was kind of surprised when my mom is like, you are right, that woman must be awful. Keep telling me, you know. And later my mother explained, she said, well, if I contradict him the way I tell you to eat your broccoli, Fredo, you know, obviously I'm not going to treat him like that. And if you got, you know, you got injured in school, that's because you're running too fast. No, I cannot tell them that. And, you know, 1 + 1 = 2 and 2 + 2 = 4. I cannot use that logic with them. You have to navigate their own logic, because if I say it's all your fault and that poor wife probably doesn't even know her husband is a homosexual and sleeping with you, then guess what? He's going to throw a tantrum, walk out, and I would have missed the chance to help him, but especially his victims. Interesting. That was my mother's logic. So I figured, Trump, you know, why does Putin keep attacking Melania and Trump doesn't respond? That's been a very strange conundrum. So I get the feeling that Putin unconsciously wants to prove to himself and to the world that Trump doesn't care about Melania. Therefore, he doesn't defend her against Putin's attacks, or the Russian media, the propagandist attacks. Therefore, Putin is the real number 2. Oh, one sec. And if you notice how Putin also goes out of his way to warn others and blame others for getting in between him and Trump, which is also kind of strange and unusual. Putin will say, Trump and I, you know, have solved a lot of problems, but if it was not for those European leaders, and in Alaska at the press conference, he said, and I warned those European leaders not to even try to get between me and Trump. It's a very strange kind of, if you just see the politics of it. Putin has blamed EU leaders. He has blamed congressmen, dark forces, Russophobic forces inside the, you know, the U.S., the equivalent of the VPK, I guess, the military-industrial complex. He's always blaming people for standing between him and Trump. For him, it's extremely important to be seen with Trump, to be Trump's number 2. And I thought Trump had it all figured out. But then came Alaska, and I was very surprised, because I swore that once they finished talking, you know, discreetly, just the teams, they would appear and Trump would take the lead, which is what, you know, somebody who knows the psychology would have done. Trump would have come out and said, hi, everybody, thanks for coming, welcome to Alaska. My great friend Putin and I have had 4 hours of discussions with our staff, and we've come to the following 3 points, you know. Putin is going to leave Ukraine in exchange for, you know, no sanctions, in exchange for returning all that money from Belgium, in exchange for whatever, and it's all a misunderstanding. And I expected him to do that because I guess I was giving him that kind of credit. And instead, when Putin and Trump appeared, and Putin is the one that took the word and started dictating and saying and doing and, you know, and interpreting everything, and Alaska used to be a Russian and all this, to me, that was very strange, and it's disturbing, because that means that Trump probably does not know what he's doing when handling Putin. You know, I had given him way too much credit. Anyway, if I had been correct about Trump's actions, that meeting would have gone very differently. But then there are also consequences for the future government of Russia. Hopefully, it'll come from the democratic forces. Hopefully, you know, people that would feel at home in this house and looking at all those portraits. And it's completely possible that that can happen. I mean, we've seen even weirder things in our lifetimes regarding the Soviet Union and Russia and the collapse of the peaceful collapse of that empire in '89 and '91. So, you know, here I am a lot more optimistic. So, the only good thing about all this is that not only Putin, but Putinism will be so thoroughly discredited once the regime falls, if and when it falls. And again, I get the feeling that people will start talking openly about some of these things that right now, obviously, they're constrained. And that's going to be a huge window of opportunity for the big reforms that could potentially come in Russia. I remember when Alexander Nikolaevich Yakovlev, after the coup d'etat, the failed coup against Gorbachev in August of '91, said it would have taken us 5 years. If not for this coup, it would have taken us 5 years to do even just minimal things. But thanks to this coup and these people discredited themselves, we can do these reforms very quick, you know. I'll never forget the words of Gennady Eduardovich Burbulis, who happened to be a very good friend of mine. As you know, he was one of the 6 signatories of the Bielavieja Accord that dissolved the Soviet Union peacefully. He was Russia's number 2 in the political hierarchy. And he always emphasized, when we brought him to Washington to celebrate one of the anniversaries, you remember that, of the signing of the Bielavieja Accords, together with Shushkevich and Kravchuk. And Burbulis wondered, he said, you know, ни один полковник противоречил наш Беловежский договор. Not a single military officer opposed openly our, you know, Bielavieja Accord that dissolved the Soviet Union, which is so counterintuitive. If you had said that that was going to happen 5 years earlier, people would have just laughed at you. So when these military officers are sworn to protect the Soviet Union, you know, how would they just simply not even raise, not even a small peep, you know, when these men got together in Vyskuly and signed the end of the Soviet Union? Vadim Viktorovich Bakatin, who was, as you know, the last chairman of the KGB, he was the only person that both Yeltsin's team and Gorbachev's team trusted to head the KGB, a very sensitive thing right after that coup. And Bakatin mentioned several times that he faced zero resistance when dissolving, you know, the KGB and creating other agencies in its stead. Not only that, he even ordered them to gather all the files as a good gesture to America on the bugging of the new building, the American embassy in, you know, in Moscow. And they used to have a joke. They said that that building was made of a very advanced material called microconcrete. So it's 20% concrete and 80% microphones. So he gave all those files to the ambassador, to Jack Matlock. Here, you know, this is what the KGB has on that bugging. And thanks to that, American intelligence not only, you know, would dig out those microphones, or I forget, tore the building down, whatever they did, but they discovered all the networks in Western Europe where a lot of those things had been prefabricated that had also been cooperating with the KGB. So that, you know, they dismantled a lot of these things. And Bakatin faced no opposition and no criticism inside the KGB after the regime was so discredited. Communism and the coup plotters were so discredited, they could do so many things, some huge reforms. We all remember Yevgeny Sevastyanov, who the minute Yeltsin signed that decree banning the Communist Party, and the famous, you know, Chitaitia, when he was telling Gorbachev after the coup, embarrassing Gorbachev in front of the Russian parliament, and he signed, I have just decreed that the Communist Party in Russian territory is illegal. Yevgeny Sevastyanov went to Staraya Ploshad, to the Central Committee headquarters, and basically just walked in and said, the Russian government is taking over this. And he said the people were fleeing like cockroaches. Nobody even questioned why he was there or what, or tried to stop him. And I know Ilya Panamaryov here at the house, he couldn't be here today, but he wrote that book, Does Putin Have to Die? And he speaks about a similar incident in Siberia, where in some city, when the local authorities of Putin is that, you know, wouldn't think twice about sending the police to beat people up, when they felt that the people were too many and they couldn't control them, they all fled those buildings, you know, they just literally fled. So we hear an echo of that when Prigozhin was marching towards Moscow. So Russia will be extremely weak, but Russia will also be quite strong, paradoxically. And this is the Russian Democrats really need to internalize. And I've had discussions with them about this. So why strong? Because whoever controls the Kremlin next will have all these secrets of the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, their weapons programs, how advanced they are, what are their vulnerabilities, even of the leaders themselves. And that's currency with, you know, the United States, with the Western Alliance. But they're also going to have a lot of the secrets of a lot of the elites in Washington, and not only Paris, Berlin, obviously, that dealt with Russia, you know, over the years, that are now safely guarded, obviously, by the Kremlin for compromat material. The Russian Democrats are going to have access to those KGB files as well, KGB and FSB and SVR. And it's going to be very tempting for them to use that information strategically, but I've told the Russian Democrats that that would be a huge mistake, Because when they come to power, I don't know, the types of people that we've always suspected were not exactly in tune with what Washington's national security interests are, and kind of had shady relations with the Kremlin. Of course, I'm thinking of people like Stroke Talbot or Celeste Wallander or Richard Burns. They probably will get down on their knees and beg the new leader of Russia to not release their personal information. But I've told them, look, you need to bite the bullet, just release those files and let the chips fall where they may, because otherwise these people will continue to be back every time there's some, new White House administrator. They're going to be back handling Russia, and their incentive is to sabotage you, to make sure you as the democratic Russians don't succeed, so that they can, protect those files under the people they've had contacts with since Soviet times, and not just Putin. So anyway, those, of course, are all just wishful thinking, speculation. But in other words, Putin's psychology and psychopathologies do have an impact on not only his governance, and we can explain a lot of phenomena that are otherwise mysterious to political scientists and others, analysts, as to Putin's behavior, but we can also kind of start to see a few Plato-style shadows in the cave as to why Trump treats Putin in such an, counterintuitive way. But the optimism is that when Putinism falls, it will not be like when Pinochet fell. Pinochet, as you know, ruled Chile for almost 2 decades, and he still had the support of half the population that remembered the bad old days of Allende. And Pinochet barely lost that referendum he made, and then, continued to have a lot of support among the Chilean population, which is why the new democratic government of Patricio Aylwin, who I happen to know, rest in peace, Patricio Aylwin, treaded very carefully with Pinochet and his legacy, and did not try to remove his immunity and things like that, because he knew that half of Chile still supported Pinochet. It is not going to be like that with Vladimir Putin in Russia. The Russian Democrats can rest assured that once Putin falls, he will be so discredited that Russia, when the leadership and the regime are discredited, when Russia loses a war, these are the times of big, big, bold reforms, and nothing will stand in your way. Anyway, thank you very much for, the pleasure of your company. So we have this one, and you need to turn it on. There we go.
It's recording, so I can just speak. Okay. The only question I wanted to ask is, when you were mentioning that making assaults against Melania, what assaults do you mean? I've never heard.
Insults.
Yeah, insults. Was that done and obviously in private? Were there any publicly?
No, they're all over the news. You remember when they put images of Melania naked on Russian television? That's just one of many instances. Recently, there was another incident when the Russian media was attacking her, and of course, without Putin's permission, there's no way the Russian propagandists are going to attack Melania, insinuating that she was a whore and things like that, or she was a call girl back in the, before she married Trump. I mean, all these things that you would expect Trump to be angry and react, and that's my wife you're talking about, And Trump yet kind of like, oh no, Putin is my friend, and that's again paradoxical. But yeah, there were several instances of that.
Okay.
I wanted to say thank you because I enjoyed that immensely, even though I disagreed with you 100%.
I knew there had to be a but in there.
It was
but
pleasant.
Thank you, Michael.
It was pleasant to sit through something original. And I know that a lot of people in the audience were also in disagreement with some certain points.
Good.
Right.
That's why we're here.
Exactly. And for them, what I want to say is what you felt in that presentation is what I feel Fiona Hill or Michael McFaul or choose your favorite Russia expert, when they get up and talk, that's the way I feel, the way you felt during Arias' presentation. Thank you for being original, even though I disagree with you. Thank you for being original. I want to ask about methodology, because mine is to watch everything that Putin has said over the past 25, or there's the interview from 92 too, years plus. I've probably watched 800 hours, and I have seen the Putin that you saw. I've also seen the Putin that Fiona Hill sees, and I've seen the Putin that Mikhail Ziegler sees, because he's phenomenally good at being all things to all people. What's your methodology? You looked in a place that nobody else looks. Thank you for doing that. How did you get there, and how do you do it?
Thank you, Michael, for bringing that up, because full disclosure, Fiona Hill and Mike McFaul were editors, executive editors of Democratizatia many years. So, and I think, bringing out the files on all the Russia experts, as painful as it is for everybody when the Russian Democrats come to power, it's also going to, I think, is going to elevate those that deserve to be elevated. I don't think any serious person would think that Fiona or Mike were somehow in cahoots with the Kremlin in any occasion. And that probably explains just Putin's hysterical hatred of them, specifically Mike McFaul. He even told Trump, remember, I think it was in Helsinki, he said, you need to, hand over Mike McFaul to me so I can try him for theft, or I forget them, just delusions. But anyway, Fiona Hill wrote an amazing book on Putin, very much a psychological portrait of Putin. And exactly as you say, Michael, Putin is enigmatic, and he has numerous personalities. Of the 21 symptoms that I mentioned, that I only kind of in depth dealt with 4, that's one of the 21. Homosexual men, because they were so repressed and so suffering and so vulnerable, they create multiple personalities, so that when one of them is challenged and destroyed, they can always move to the other one, And so when I read Fiona's book, I was convinced that Fiona, in a very politically correct, kind of career-safe way, was saying, well, Putin has all these personalities simply because this is one of the symptoms of his homosexuality. I assume that. And in fact, in my paper, Lelieshia Bide, I cite that book and several examples. Fiona did not know that, which is curious. Fiona touched upon several of the 21 symptoms of this type of patient without realizing she was onto something, because nobody sat there and, taught her in Abnormal Psychology 101 in England or wherever or at Harvard when she came to college here, how to spot these things. She was just using more conventional, political sciences, historiography or whatever tools. So thank you for bringing that up. But that is one of the other symptoms of homosexual men in denial, and there's a whole set of articles. My father did not discover them. Bergler did not discover them. I kind of found them in some of the academic articles in the Journal of Homosexuality.
Thank you so much for this very insightful panel. I wanted to ask you about Putin's victims. You mentioned that Yuri Shekachyhin was one of the first one. There is a theory that Anatoly Sobchak actually was the first one because he could have known some of Putin's secrets. So I was wondering, what is your take on that? And another thing about Shekachyhin, you mentioned that Putin used lots of poison, that his body shrank. So could you elaborate on that also?
Sure. And thanks for coming for the talk. I was with Yuri Petrovich. There he is on the wall. Yuri Petrovich was like a brother to me. And I was with him just a few months before he was killed. And what I remember from that conversation, because every time I went to Moscow, I would drop in and see Yuri Petrovich, either in Moscow or in Peredelkino, where he also had a house. I knew his, to this day, I'm friends with his former wife, Nadia Ashgichina, who's our great friend. She visited me in Mexico recently. And she's the one that mentioned that, because remember that Yuri Petrovich was one of the first victims of poisoning. He was not the first. I think Yushchenkov, not Yushchenko, Viktor Yushchenkov was, I think, the first one. Yuri was like the second or third. So far, Putin, so far of Putin's enemies that have died from poison, it's like 60-something, or have been seriously ill from poison, 60-something. And what's strange about that is that he poisons them, even though he denies it, of course. But, Novichok and polonium can only come from the Russian government, from the military, from the secret services. So Putin poisons to demonstrate to the world that he did it, kind of like Scotland Yard would immediately know, just because they didn't even bother to hide the crime, the lovers of the victim that they found dead, you know. So Yuri Petrovich told me two things that, I believe it was April 2003, when I went to visit him. He said two new things, which I kind of, you know, stayed in my head bouncing around. He said, look, I got a new huge apartment over there, courtesy of the Russian government, because he was also a member of the Duma. And I'm like, yes, but Yuri, you criticize Putin too much all the time, and you expose him in the newspapers, and he was Russia's leading investigative reporter, as you know. And he's like, yeah, but that's the paradox of Russia. You can criticize the government all you want, and they still give you a huge apartment. You know, it's like, I wouldn't take that if I were you. And the second thing he told me was, isn't it great that Russia is finally evolving because we have a homosexual president? How the hell did he find that out? I do not know. He told me clear as day. And he's like, that's great. And because he was a classic liberal. He was one of those great Russian liberals like Starovoytova, you know, or like Genial Bats, or, you know, that don't give any importance to that topic, unlike the other 98% of, you know, the Russian population that would definitely think of that as a huge liability, political liability. But Yuri Petrovich was like, isn't that great, you know? And he knew something about Putin that the rest of Russia did not know. And as far as I know, he never published it in the newspapers or whatever. Because a lot of the reaction I've gotten from my papers, I can divide it into 4 or 5 groups. But one of those groups says, yeah, but it doesn't matter. It has zero relevance for, you know, his governing or his this or with that. Zhenya Albas told me the words I'll never forget at the Vilnius Russia Forum. She said, "Кого волнует, что он делает в спальне?" You know, who cares what he does in the bedroom? And I'm like, well, there are a lot of psychopathologies, baggage, you know, and we can see that with Putin. But Yuri Petrovich was one of those that didn't think that was important at all, you know, back. And then that was the last time I saw Yuri Petrovich. And when they tried to take tissue samples at his funeral, his own family members, they were told not to by these strange men who were there in civilian clothes, saying you cannot get close to the body. They noticed his body had shrunk, but they couldn't take hair or skin samples as they tried to, you know, do an official autopsy. And they probably would have discovered, because at that time, you know, the poisoning fetish by Putin was just getting started. So it wasn't obvious what had happened, you know. Margie.
I'm wondering about Alaska, and if you could bring us to more analysis, not so much of Trump, but other reasons why you were surprised at what happened in the relationship. I mean, some of what happened with Putin being so delighted to be in the car privately might conform to your theories, other things maybe not. So if we could go back to more close analysis of Alaska with emphasis on Putin rather than on Trump, that would be great. And then as a footnote, I'd be interested to know how the film was done and how you met Pussy Riot ally or Zhilov and what happened with that.
Thanks, Margie. Well, full disclosure, I love the Russian Democrats, and I'm always running into them. And Pyotr Verzilov over there was married to, he was also poisoned, by the way, you know, very powerfully. His new girlfriend found him, when I say new girlfriend, because he was married to Nadia Tolokonikova, the iconic, you know, lady of Pussy Riot. The other one being Masha Alyokhina. And there's a few more, but those were kind of the core. Then they got a divorce, and then his new girlfriend found him lying down on the apartment floor when she came in, and fortuitously, because immediately they rushed to help him. And what's funny is that the Russian doctors, when they get a patient like that of a very high-profile political case and comes in unconscious or in a coma for no obvious reason, the doctors of Russia are not stupid, and they immediately administer all kinds of antidotes, and they stabilize him based on the theory that he may have been poisoned. But then they come out to the press and the cameras and they say, oh no, he was, you know, his sugar was down, or whatever it is they have to say, the official line. But the fact is that they treated him with exactly what they should be treating him, just to stabilize him. And then a friend of ours from Berlin flew him in a medevac, organized everything to fly Piotr Verzilov to Berlin, where he spent several weeks in a coma at the Charité hospital. I was telling them that maybe you should send him to that clinic in Vienna where they cured Viktor Yushchenko. Although that clinic in Vienna where they rushed, Viktor Yushchenko after his poisoning, the doctor who discovered what it was based on the symptoms, and I guess just calling back and forth, is just 2 hours away south, or whatever. Is it south of Charlottesville? South of here? And his name is Christopher Holstich. He's the Austrian doctors that had Viktor Yushchenko there, and they didn't know what he had, and they were trying to cure him. Immediately he's like, oh, I bet you anything is ricin, give him this, give him that, and that's how they saved his life, and thanks to Christopher Holstich. So then I contacted Christopher Holstich again, and I said, well, we have a new case, and he's like, I'll be on standby. But apparently the people in the Charité hospital, said, no, we know what to do. I'm the one that financed his medevac to Berlin, so I'm very proud of my good friend Piotr Verzilov. So how did I meet them? How Pussy Riot? There's friends of mine of many years. I think it's a state secret. I was the first outside investor in Mediazona. And one of the great things they did back for me was this video. They're very brave people, extremely brave. I really admire Pussy Riot. Piotr Verzilov, they think is Novichok, but they're not sure because apparently at that point, the Novichok had metabolized to the point where it was not so easily detectable unless they opened him in a way, or I forget what they told me. I'm not an expert on poisons and toxicology, but they think from the symptoms it was Novichok. That's usually how it's done. That's how it was done apparently with Navalny the first time when, he started to have all kinds of pain and convulsions inside, the airplane itself, and people were filming him. Later, the people from his own foundation, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, went back to that room, interestingly. Not only that, but that Bulgarian investigator even called the KGB people who poisoned him. Exactly, Grozev.
His father actually,
There's a whole movie. No, the guy's incredible. But he discovered the KGB people, and with Navalny, they called them. They called them live, and they're like, how could you mess this up? And they're pretending to be other KGB officers or senior officials in the Kremlin. And then, and they admitted everything, and then suddenly it was like, guess what? You're on candid camera type of thing, silence. But no, they didn't even clean up very well back in I think it was Omsk, I forget what city they were in Siberia where they poisoned him, because they went to his room and they gathered all kinds of items, and they found Novichok in one of the water bottles. So. That's right, one of the, I forget what, but yes. Oh yeah, Trump, Alaska, Putin. I don't know any more than you do, Margie, frankly. I mean, I'm telling you, all I was expecting was for Trump, if he had really known the psychology, if he had had a modern-day Edmund Burglar advising him at the NSC or something, what he would have done is we would have come out and said, even if Putin would be like, what? We did not talk about that. We talked about the weather. Putin wouldn't be in no position to say anything against Trump at that moment if Trump gave him a very good deal, take it or leave it, in front of the whole world. Putin and I agreed that he would leave Ukraine in exchange for this, and my friend Putin, and he's going to be my unconditional number 2, and I'm not going to solve anything in Europe or the Middle East without his advice. And that is probably what Putin unconsciously was seeking. But then Trump allows Putin to talk, and Putin took the agenda, and and I'll never forget the words of Arnold Schwarzenegger, who said that Trump looked like a wet noodle up there, and that's kind of my take, But I have. Putin definitely played it because Trump allowed him to play it for some strange reason that I don't understand. Yeah. Anyone else? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Please don't leave. If you don't mind, give a minute of